September 11th, and also New Jersey, and then came back to the US after a violation of my academic freedom where I was teaching at a university in Jordan. And I was minding my business, teaching English at Guilford College, which is a small Quaker school in Greensboro. It's a lovely liberal arts institution. When in 2015, we were watching in horror as hundreds of thousands of Syrian refugees were trying to make their way out of Syria. And that image of the little boy, Aylan Kurdi, really broke our collective hearts. And I wondered what I could do with my position at Guilford College, with the resources that I had at my disposal. And Pope Francis, and I appreciate someone who's telling me that, the connection to Catholicism. I was truly inspired by his call on small communities to host refugee families. So he called on every parish in Europe to host a refugee family, and I was really inspired by that idea of asking smaller communities to do the work of radical hospitality rather than thinking about big countries doing that work. And the word in Arabic for campus is haram, haram al-jami. It's a beautiful word. It means a sanctuary. And so it just sort of clicked in my head, the Pope must be calling on us to do that work. And so we started in 2015 hosting refugees on Guilford's campus. And we've been hosting refugees on Guilford's campus ever since. We just welcomed another family of 6 a couple of weeks ago. And we typically host families, as large as 11 members and sometimes single cases. Most recently, we hosted 16 Afghan evacuees. But ICAR, the acronym for Every Campus Refuge, has spread to campuses across the country. And so a lot of what I do now is just try to mobilize colleges and universities across the US to do similar work, which is to leverage their resources to support newcomers into their community. So this book, American Refuge, really is about that in many ways, and it contains the stories of my own mother, who was a Palestinian refugee, of course, and my grandmother, and 6 individuals who participated in this Every Campus a Refuge program, especially as hosted guests. Their names are Ali Al-Khazraji, Marwa Azaji, Blaise Pascal, Hisar Way, Chaps Joram, and Fehmi. And I want to just point out the artwork on the cover. So if you take a look, this is actually created for this book by Ali, one of the hosted guests. He's an Iraqi calligraphist and artist. And I asked him to create Lady Liberty out of Arabic calligraphy. And so this actually says the word refugee in Arabic. So the red script there says refugee. And I just think it's a lovely image that encapsulates the promise of America for me as an immigrant and as a newcomer myself, and the children of refugees. I find a lot of hope in this particular artistic creation. All of these people, I knew their stories very intimately because I worked with them for years as part of the ICAR program on Guilford's campus. But I did interview them officially for this book because I wanted them to share what they wanted to share and not share what they didn't want to share. And so the stories, I hope, carry the cadence and the style of each person, and the stories I truly reflect what they wanted their experience, what they wanted of their experience to be shared and how they wanted it to be told. So I hope that you can listen for that cadence and that rhythm of each character. I'll read some sections from the portions in the book where they appear. So why I wrote this book is, I think, one of the key things that I want to talk about today before I start reading. So as a teacher, I've been teaching for 24 years. And it was always a challenge for me to find books when I teach about refugees and immigrants, but refugees specifically, that represent the holistic experience of someone who was living a life before they became a refugee. There aren't many narratives that capture that spectrum of the before, the moment of rupture, the moment of pain, the life in the refugee camp, and then the journey to the resettlement site, and then post-resettlement. Right? So I wanted to capture that sort of that spectrum, that journey before, during, and after. And I wanted to capture that breadth and depth, but in individualized, personal ways. I also wanted to write a book that didn't pander to the spectacle of tragedy. So I teach a lot of literature that's by brown and black people, about brown and black people. And the literature that tends to be popular is one that creates a spectacle of tragic things. Like we sort of relish in that tragic aspect. And I really wanted to create a narrative that was grounded in dignity and that avoided that kind of spectacle, that told things plainly in ways that were personal and didn't make characters into pitiable creatures. And I also, very importantly, wanted to write a book that busted myths about refugees. There's so many circulating myths about refugees, who they are, what they experience, what they get when they come here, the kind of support that they receive. And I wanted to uplift certain facts about the refugee experience that many of us don't know. And so you'll see that there's actually a chapter at the end of the book that gives a lot of details about the US history of resettlement and defines certain terms that we tend to use interchangeably, like asylum seeker and refugee, or undocumented and documented. And so I wanted it to be educational, but I also wanted it to be grounded in these personal narratives. So one very damaging myths about refugees is that they leave, quote, shithole countries. That they leave countries that they don't love, that they leave countries that they're eager to leave behind. And of course, that's not true. Refugees are refugees because they have no choice, right? They leave their countries because they must leave, or they're threatened with death, or the death of loved ones. So I want to read a little bit from Ali's experience in Iraq to give you a sense of kind of his life before he left. Ali was born in Baghdad in 1971. He's the second of 6 children, 2 boys and 4 girls. His childhood was wonderful, made more wonderful by the women in his life. Like his milk teacher in kindergarten. She was so beautiful. Ali drank the milk she handed out to the children, even though he hated it. Her beauty overcame him, so that he asked his father to exchange her for his mother. His heart broke when she was gone the next year. Like his neighbor Amna. As a baby, he would wake up early, the first to open his eyes in the house, driving his mother crazy, and he would descend the stairs and crawl to the wall that separated them from the neighbors and call to her, Anna, Anna. Hearing him on the other side of the wall, Amna would ululate as if her groom had arrived, and his mother would lift him over the wall to hand him over to Amna's family. They would play with him all day, ululating and clapping and singing, as if he were a husband handed over from his family to his brides to spend the day. When Amna got married, I was so heartbroken, he cried during the entire ceremony. He refused to take a picture with her in her beautiful white dress when she asked him to. A 5-year-old lover betrayed. Like his youngest aunt, Ibtisam, who lived with them and was raised by Ali's father, her brother. She took him with her everywhere she went, to visit friends, to attend vocational school, to shop at the market, even to clean him in the shower. At night, he slept next to her. When she didn't take him on her service trip, instituted by Saddam for youth to build affordable houses during their summer vacations, and took his older brother instead, his heart was broken. He could not stand being parted from her for that long. A 7-year-old best friend betrayed. Like his grandmother, who in the long tradition of Iraqis, before the war changed the very air and made the trees less frequent than the buildings, would sleep next to him on the roof in the summer. She always came down to sleep indoors in September when the nights were too cold for summer sleeping, but warm enough for the gentle fanning of the mahaffa, the fan made from palm leaves by the women of the house. The stationary roof beds, made of metal and painted to withstand the winter weather, were set up in rows, a bed for each family member. Every night, they were decked with mattresses and pillows brought up from the house. Ali's family had so many members, their roof looked like a barracks. with extra beds for summer guests. As soon as the sun set, his grandmother would call him so that together they could spray water on the roof floor to cool it down. By the time the family went to sleep, the beds would be so wet and dewy, they felt cold. He would sleep with his grandmother and aunt on the upper roof, elevated above the lower roof where the rest of the family slept by a flight of stairs. His grandmother's dawn sounds usually woke him, drinking and gurgling with the water from her jug, her gunda, making her ablutions for the dawn prayer. Like his mother, who knew and memorized all of the traditional songs sung to children, the songs about Eid, the songs about playing in the street, the songs about marriage, the songs about birth, the songs about leaving your family, and the songs especially for girls and the songs especially for boys, for one cannot spin the beauty of boys and girls in the same way, in the same song. This is from Chups. For your books, it's on page 22. Chups was born in Uganda in 1990. His mother died when he was 5 years old. His father had other women, 2 or 3 perhaps, and so his grandmother raised him in her lap, in her small house. She was the best of women, and life was good with her. In Sabini, she would tell him chachankwet, stories, prose poems of lessons meant to build up his life. Sometime in the before, long time ago, all the people would gather together and drink and tell stories about their wealth. One man would say, I have my cow, another, my 4 bulls, and yet another, I have my farm. One day, a man who had no wealth wanted to be part of the boasting. I have a hen that always wakes me up in the morning. One of the members present yoo-yooed and made fun of him. No one wants to hear about your hen. What are you talking about? People are talking about cows and bulls and farms, and you are talking about your hen. The shamed man kept quiet. He was a poor man who had wanted to feel that he too possessed something that meant something. A something unto which he could gaze and say, this is something big in my life. And so he kept quiet, quit the group, and went to sleep. In the morning, he got up, carried his spear, and walked over to the house of the man who said his hen was too small in the face of all the cows, the bulls, and the farms. At the door of the belittler's house, he asked the wife, is your husband still here? Yes, the wife replied. He is still sleeping. And so he walked in, killed him in his sleep, piercing him with his spear until its tip met the ground underneath. Look to the words that come out of your mouth, his grandmother would say. Watch them. At the time, they might look good to you. You may like those words. Your friends may like them. But the person you are talking to, their soul, might be a stranger to you. You never know what kind of person they are. Be with your friends, but learn how to speak. It will help you in life. Chups takes this lesson to heart later as he escapes the camp Takuma. But I won't read that here. You'll have to read it in the book. Another myth, of course, is that refugees leave by choice. As I said, they're forced to leave. And I want to read you the reason why I left. This is on page 49. It's on 52. In the late 2000s, Ali worked a very brief time for an American company that provided maintenance for Iraqi vehicles. He typeset schedules, created stamps, and designed business cards. He didn't last long in that job. People working with such companies, even if marginally, were constantly threatened and attacked. Ali marginally survived 2 assassination attempts. The first time, he had been on his way to work while Marwa and their children slept soundly at her parents' home. He casually walked past the fridge on the street, on his usual route to his parked car. He absentmindedly noted its presence without surprise. It was always litter, even that big, on the streets of Baghdad in those days. The city always disemboweled itself. The bomb left for him in the fridge exploded behind him when he was just a few meters ahead. Had it exploded sooner, had he been closer, he would have been killed, but he was just out of bounds for death. He heard the explosion first and then felt a stinging heat slurp at his back. Shrapnel from the fridge fiercely kissed him in his back, head, and bottom. He spent days in the hospital. They removed what they could of the shrapnel, the pieces visibly sticking out, and deflated the hot air caught in his lungs, suffocating him. To do so, they had to insert a tube through his side to let out the air as if he were an overblown balloon. The second time, he had been on his way back from work. The first assassination attempt had made him constantly vigilant, suspicious, on the alert about who was in the street with him, behind him, ahead of him, who was walking where and how far away from him. It was this hypervigilance that saved him. On this relatively quiet road, he immediately noticed the car behind him, driving too fast, as if hell-bent on getting something done and out of the way. As soon as he turned to look at the car, he saw the driver stick out his hand. Ali instantly dove. Had he been a few seconds too late in his reaction, he would not have turned just in time to see the hand, to see the gun, just in time to dive, just in time for the bullet to catch him in the leg and not the chest. Bleeding and in pain, Ali called his brothers to take him home. The spot where the bullet hit him is gnarly and fleshy now, because he was too scared to go to the hospital where he believed he would be exposing himself to more attacks. And so he treated himself at home. The gnarly flesh slowly healed, gnarly and fleshy. This is Marwa's story, his wife. In June 2014, the other life took yet another dangerous turn. Marwa had been shopping for Eid clothes for her children. She hadn't known, like her mother had, that everyone woke up that day to Mosul being consumed by Daesh, the radical fundamentalist militia, commonly in the US as the Islamic State or ISIS. One after another, the cities fell. Her husband applied for asylum because the family could not bear it anymore. The terror of the trucks, again filled with armed young men, presumably gangs resisting Daesh. The dirty wars alive and well a decade later, they were surrounded by people fighting one another. And like all similarly dirty wars, it wasn't clear who was who and who was fighting who and what they were fighting for. In the silence of the night, she would sit on her bed and nurse her youngest, Yusuf, and watch the gangs, her balcony overlooking theirs, in the building next door. They had taken it over and were massing there. Marwa would wonder, vulnerable in that house, can they make that jump from their balcony to mine if they wanted to? Can they kill me and my children? They have taken over homes, lands, farms. Will ours be next? Why not her next? Everything else was being erased. History, culture, mosques, museums, drilled, exposed, exploded, destroyed. The world called this a liberation, but it was really an evisceration, an erasure. And the country no longer felt like her country. Moving from one province, one district, one city to the next was a leap of faith that the gangs that would stop them would be from their sect and wouldn't shoot them in the head right then after looking at their IDs. One time, she and her husband and infant boy were en route to visit her parents, where Al-Qaeda was in control. They were stopped by bandits whose faces were covered. The car driver had already made his peace and told them that he was not responsible for any passengers. The disclaimer for lost lives as casual as the disclaimer for lost luggage. She prayed hard there with Ali in front and little Aboudi in her lap. When they asked the men for their IDs, she turned her face in anticipation of their kill. Ali's name looks like it's from a sect that is opposed to theirs. Ali begged them to call his uncle, a man well known in their neighborhood. They let them go. She walked into her parents' house, yellow-faced, every drop of blood drained. She refused to go back to that house until Al-Qaeda left. Liberation is equally painful as the siege. If this is no longer my country, can this be my home? Myra wondered. Another myth is that refugees are not carefully vetted. So we hear that quite a bit, is that anybody can come in, anybody can be a refugee, accepted as a refugee. One of the important facts about refugee process is that actually it takes up 2 to 5 years for refugees to be vetted. There's a lot of processing. They have to do a lot of interviews where they prove their case. And so it's a kind of a living and reliving of trauma as they tell their stories to their interrogators, whether it's the U.S. government or the resettlement agency or the UNHCR or whatever it is. So I want to read you from Fehmi's experience. This is on page 39. When I started working with refugees in 2016, I had not known about this particular requirement. The repeated screening interviews, which necessitate the repeated, unchanging, identical narration of the origin story of why one became a refugee. When we hosted our first Syrian family on Guildford College's campus, I went in those early days of our friendship to visit them. I sat down for tea with the mother, Fehmi, in their spacious living room facing the woods. I had come casually in the way of Arabs, and I can't remember what I asked. It was a simple question, polite, harmless. Something like, how are you doing? I know now that questions about one's being, when asked of a refugee, are never simple. Their experiences have taught them that such questions are a test upon which their very futures, their very safety, their very being, which I was seemingly harmlessly asking, depends. How are you doing? Fehmi's answer came quickly, easily, and at length. A perfect, flawless, rehearsed, and deeply painful and intimate origin story. The beautiful building in Homs, the plans for more levels on top for the other sons about to get married, then the darkness, the neighbors slaughtered, including the toddlers and the infants, their throats slit, the fear that it was the other neighbors who had done it. She had recognized his voice under the mask when he came around that day, threatening. He used to come over for tea in the before days, unmasked and gunless. Then a gas canister exploded in the house. She came out, blackened, and unthinkingly cursed Bashar. The neighbor heard her. She tried to cover up what she said, but she knew their days were numbered. The next day, 40 men came, masked, and threatened to kill her entire family. They tried to take her youngest son, Tamer, then 10, because they said he had been at a protest against Bashar. Under the cover of night, they gathered themselves, so many of them, all the sons, all the daughters, all of their husbands and wives and children, and fled. Along the way, a very long journey, they were almost run off the roads by highway bandits, hid in bombed-out buildings, nearly lost a baby when in the chaos of an explosion, everybody scattered and her daughter gave her granddaughter quickly to someone else. They found the baby the next day, taken care of, but many other children, the children and grandchildren of others, including her own siblings' children and grandchildren, were not so lucky. At the end of her recitation, she kept saying that while it was hard, they made it with their honor intact. So many women had been raped. They had narrowly escaped that and were so proud and grateful that they had. What we have tasted, no one has tasted, she told me. At the time, this origin story seemed to come out of nowhere, an unasked for explanation, a justification that was never demanded. Only later, when I found out about the repeated proof of misery required of refugees in the claims assessment process, did I understand. My question and the dynamic of our relationship, the need for our support, the fear of it being taken away, triggered that recitation, that soliloquy on the stage of refugeedom, a trauma constantly triggered and re-triggered by the refugee admissions and resettlement process. also like to read about Chubbs's experience with interviews. Chubbs gained refugee status because he's a member of the LGBTQ community. When Chubbs eventually reached Nairobi, he had to tell his story to the UN official. In those interviews, Chubbs's grandmother's lessons worked. He looked to his words, knew what to say, watched them as they came out of his mouth. The people who interviewed him were strangers to his soul. Within 4 years, his case was processed. 3 of them were spent in Kakuma, 1 in Nairobi. His roommate, Marcel, however, remains in Kakuma 8 years later. Marcel asks friends who have resettled for the money he needs to buy some water cans and some seeds to plant his garden in the camp. He stayed behind because he did not know how to defend himself in those interviews. In The Vote of That Lion, he was the goat. In the interviews, when they asked Chubbs about his private life, prodding him to prove his case, he bit down on his dignity, clamped it down so that he could tell them it was painful, shameful, hard for him to say. Where was the whistle now so that instead of the words, too hard to say, he could simply breathe out his response to their call? For others like Marcel, who is elderly and interrogated by a young woman asking questions about his most private life, it is hard to set down one story, to answer the probing, direct questions, to lay oneself bare before a stranger to one's soul. Marcel goes back again and again, hoping, waiting, wishing that the next time he goes, the interviewer will be older, with gray hair like him, and maybe, just maybe, a member of the LGBTQ community with whom he can use the whistle instead of the words that catch in his throat and refuse to come out. So that's an interesting example there of, not being able to gain asylum because the interview process can be so incredibly challenging. Another myth is that refugees resettle. In fact, 99% of refugees never resettle. Only 1% of refugees resettle. There are, at the moment, I want to say up to 28 million documented refugees. There are 86 million displaced individuals, but 28 million with refugee status, and less than 1% of those will ever resettle. Most refugees, for generations, will live in camps, right? Their children, their children's children. This is Riri's story. Riri was born in a camp. And so many refugees, that is actually true, that, as I said, for generations, they're born in camps. One does not always become a refugee. Many times, one is born a refugee. Riri was born a refugee in Thailand's Tam Phin camp. Her parents fled Burma in 1997, and this is page 73, for those of you following along. The year Tam Phin was founded, built for people just like them, sprung up to receive them. She's a year younger than that camp, born just as her parents got there. Their journey out of Burma was long and meandering. One of her older sisters, her mother, was in the early days of pregnancy with her when they fled their village in Burma, was born in the jungle during the family's long flight. 2 more girls were born in the camp. The last sister, 13 now, was born in the US. When the Burmese soldiers attacked their village, they burned everything down to ashes, including her parents' marriage certificate and family photos. When her family left, they took nothing with them except the baby in their arms and the one in her mother's belly. During the day, they hid and slept. At night, they walked. It was one of those nights that her sister was born, months after they started their journey. By the time they got to the camp, her mother had had another child in her belly, Edie. In the camp, the family initially slept on the dirt ground inside bamboo walls and plastic tarped houses with logs for corners, something resembling a foundation. But over time, her parents, who were good at designing cut-down bamboo, made their house into a plastic tarped castle with 2 stories and a balcony. And her parents worked hard. Her mother had never kept her hair long enough, even though long hair was prized, a sign of beauty. What use had she for long hair? It was always too hot anyway, and she couldn't do much or work as hard as she needed to with all that heaviness on her head. This is an example of a refugee camp that is built up to welcome refugees, or at least to host refugees. Many refugees, of course, live in urban camps, and so you'll read in the book that Fehmi and Blaze lived in cities, but as refugees. And so refugees don't necessarily resettle, but their lives aren't uniform. So their lives and experiences in refugee camps could be quite different. So I'll read a little bit more about Riri's experience, and then I want to end on what it's like to sort of, resettle here in the United States, and then take some questions. At camp, Riri went to school like all the other children. Their efforts were put on display for all to see, their successes and their failures. Life's expectations, the rituals of pride and shame, the daily concerns that mark everyday existence transpose themselves to camp life. For life in the camp doesn't know any better. It doesn't pause to marvel at its own strangeness, doesn't falter to wallow in its own existential absurdity. Camp life sticks to its story that life in here is just like life out there. What matters out there matters in here too. In short, life goes on. And at Tom Hin, education was a matter of public concern. The logic of life there rejected the supposed temporariness, the emergency of camp life, and said simply, this is normal life, and here we do normal things. So every year, the children's grades would be posted. This was fine until first grade, when Riri's grades plummeted because she could not stand her teacher, a cruel woman who would hit the students if they did not study hard enough. The teacher had one unusually cruel form of punishment. When students didn't show up for a tutoring session, she would make them carry classmates on their back and run 5 laps around the school. Riri did not want to be part of this punishment. She didn't want to burden her peers in this way. So when they rounded the building out of sight, she would hop off her classmates' backs, and together they would walk the rest of the way until they were in sight of their teacher again, when Riri would hop back on. I wanted to tell Riri that maybe, like your mother, this person insisted on hard work because that was the only way to survive camp life. Not only in the now, where success and the insistence on it could make you feel like you were somewhere else, somewhere where success mattered, made a difference, led to something, but also because it was preparation for the time after leaving the camp, when people in the real world would not be gentle with you, or care if you said, but we lived in a camp, not the world. We lived in a camp where life stood still because we needed to reflect on its existential absurdity. We lived isolated and imprisoned. Be gentle with us now as we learn how to be in the world again. Riri left the camp before her teacher did. Now she's the commencement speaker at her college graduation, the first in her family to earn a college degree. Another myth is that refugees receive a lot of support when they come here. Many of you might know, or you might not know, that refugees receive a one-time stipend of $1,000. That's all they get. And they're supposed to gain self-sufficiency within 90 days. So that $1,000 is supposed to go to rent, food, and furniture, and then that's it. You're supposed to get a job and take care of your kids. Refugees also have to pay back their plane ticket that brought them here. So they begin life here essentially in debt. The other thing that, of course, refugees have challenges with, or as you can imagine, access, language access, transportation, recertification, which is incredibly challenging. So the myth that once you get here you should be grateful and happy is incredibly damaging, because many refugees experience homesickness, loneliness, depression, and they're not able to, for example, Ali is an artist and a calligraphist, but he cuts chicken at Tyson. That's his job, even though he's a professional artist. And so even though resettlement might mean safety and security, it doesn't mean happiness. And it's really important to remember that when we're talking about refugee support and integration. So I'd like to end on a section of Fehmi's life. She's been here for 5 years and just recently become a citizen. And this is on page 121. Fehmi lives in Buffalo, New York now. Like Jennifer's family, who moved from North Carolina to Tennessee, Fihmi and her family left the state to which they first arrived. Called secondary resettlement, this happens because refugees often cannot find the opportunities they hoped for needed in the location of primary resettlement. Will our migration ever end? Fihmi asks me. Her son Noor, the only one of her children who was able to join her from Jordan, works as an Uber driver at night. During the day, he sleeps. His depression gets the better of him. Because all of her other children were over the age of 18, their cases were processed separately, and her other 2 sons and 4 daughters are still stuck in Mandela, waiting on the Refugee Resettlement Agency to call them, to tell them their time has come to also join their mother and father. In the meantime, they use dwindling food coupons to pay for rent and work odd jobs whenever they can. Their own children do not go to school and have forgotten how to write their own names. Fihmi swears to me that she would not have left her children behind in Jordan had she not needed to leave for 2 important reasons: her youngest son's Tamer's future and her own health. In Jordan, Tamer was missing out on an education, and she wanted something better for him, a life of choice and opportunity. And her own body was failing her. She needed surgeries and medications, none of which she could access living as a refugee in Mandela. Now she has access to medical supports she needs, and Tamer has just started college. But even though she has only seen comfort in the US, her soul is sick. The sight of police officers carrying weapons terrifies her, ties her tongue, paralyzes her body. All she can see in them are those men who broke into her house in Homs, masked, guns drawn, pulling away her son, threatening to kill the entire family as they had done their neighbors. And then there is the guilt that eats away at her. When her son Noor forces her to go out, to gaze upon her Lord's face in the beautiful streets and the water, all she can do is look at the beauty and wonder about what right she has to be here, to be watching the ships roll majestically into the harbor when her oldest son, Fihmi, is too depressed to leave his own home, even during Eid. He's too embarrassed to greet his nieces and nephews and not be able to put his hand in his pocket in the customary way and pull out the idea, the money that tells them that he is their uncle and that Eid is a time of joy and plenty. Instead, he sits at home in Mandela, disappearing into the size of a twig. His wife, Azar's mother, left him and their children. She could no longer handle their poverty, no longer watch her children starve. In Jordan, there are not enough jobs for Jordanians, let alone Syrians. Fihmi and Noor send what they can to their family back in Mandela, but she and her husband are too old and too sick to work, and Noor makes just enough to survive and care for his own wife and 3 children. She is in her 6th year without them. In the home country, they all lived in the same building, each son and daughter on a different floor. She's in Buffalo, watching the ships roll into the harbor. Children are living their own death, a rented life, fainting bodies under falling roofs, thousands of miles away in an ancient city with an old mosaic map. I have put my eye in God's eye, for I have nothing in my hands. It is all out of my control. I'm going to end here. I wanted to read a few more passages, but I want to give some time for Q&A. So I'm happy to take any questions or to, yes, good timing. Thank you. And thank you for being here and for listening.
What is and maybe there isn't a typical route of how the assault goes, but I'm just like curious on just like the basic like nuts and bolts, right? Of like, okay, you know, I'm in my home country and all of a sudden there's a civil war or whatever that breaks out. Like what, you know, what do I do next? Like, is there a basic process or something that like typically happens or?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And so the last chapter actually does cover a lot of that process, and you'll see it in the stories. So the way the book is structured is, you know, you hear everybody's life before, and then as they move from their country to the country next door seeking asylum, or sometimes directly to the United States. But the process is that, well, first you leave, right? I mean, so obviously you're under threat. As you say, the bombs are falling,
Right.
You're being threatened, and you find, well, if you're an internally displaced person, you might just move to another town where there isn't conflict and you're not threatened. But in the case of she moved to Jordan, so the closest border, and they presented themselves to the army there, who then took them to Madaba. This was before the creation of a Zatari camp, but you present yourself to the army, the police, and then the UNHCR processes your case, documents your case, and you're essentially applying for asylum. And so you're waiting for a very long time for the UNHCR, the refugee resettlement agencies, the US government to vet your case and to deem you eligible for resettlement. And that process takes a long time because they have to verify the story. They have to make sure, they do all kinds of background checks. And if anything happens in the process, like let's say you move or you change a phone number, or the number of people in your family changes, then that adds to the time that it takes your case to be processed, because every change then sort of brings you back to the beginning. And so you essentially have to present yourself, and you have to seek asylum, and then you have to document your case. In the book, I describe how Blaise has to do that over 17 years. Essentially, it takes him that long. He has to go back every time, and every time the story has to be the same. You can't change the story, and that's why when Othemi narrated her story to me, it was clear that it was a story that she had memorized. And it was a true story, but she had memorized the way in which to tell it. And so, yeah, you present yourself, they register you, and then they document your case, and they vet you through a variety of agencies, UNHCR, resettlement agencies, local, national, US government, or maybe wherever you might be resettling, maybe not the US, maybe Canada. And so that's the process. But you're moving from your country to a second country, which is why it's not called resettlement, right? That resettlement is really third country resettlement. And there are very few third countries that resettle, the US being one of the top third country resettlement sites.
But a country can, because I hear all the time with the Syrian refugees and stuff like that, they're your neighboring country could just be flat out and say, no, we're just not gonna accept anyone.
Yeah, I mean, they could. In the case of Jordan, there are these refugee camps at the borders, like Azatari and elsewhere, where refugees have been staying. And yes, sometimes refugees are not taken in, not accepted. It's unfortunate that the countries with the least resources are the countries that are taking in the most refugees.
Thank you so much for these stories. I just want to add another layer to the refugee story, which is that most refugees, ourselves included, and many people that I know, were not so much refugees from war and violence, as much as we're refugees from economic violence. And I think poverty is an act of violence. And so most of us are refugees from enforced poverty or sanctions that have been put in place by imperial powers and the like. And we've seen those kind of refugees increase in number over the past decades. So it's just, it adds another layer, because of course that's a story that cannot receive any kind of asylum. You can't apply for asylum and say, my wages have lost 90% of their value and there's no electricity and water. That's not considered
It's not one of the 5 reasons that you can receive refugee status.
It's not one of the 5 reasons, but it is a major reason.
Yes. As is climate change. Right?
Exactly.
And that's not, climate refugees are not, they're not, to receive the status that allows you to resettle, you have to prove persecution. And economic persecution is one of
them. And to add to the story, in Lebanon, where I'm from, 20% of our population are Syrian refugees. So, and they are, in the country we're at 80% poverty right now, and the vast majority of Syrian refugees are 99% poor. 99 is the number of Syrian refugees that are below the poverty line. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%. 99%
curious what changes you've seen in the years since you started ECAR. And the one obvious one, like, is there a difference now with the Biden administration, Trump administration, and also, politics have changed to some outside the global.
Thank you. So I'll speak from my experience over the last 7 years. So when we started, just a few months later, Trump became president and immediately instituted the Muslim ban and several executive orders that were very damaging to refugee resettlement, including the need for written permission from a community to accept resettling refugees. So resettlement agencies had to get consent from their communities that they could resettle refugees there. So that was one of the executive orders. One of the biggest changes was that refugees were no longer coming in the numbers that they were. So, for example, in Greensboro, North Carolina is one of the top states for refugee resettlement in the United States. We are second to New York on the Eastern Seaboard. Like, we're up there, which is amazing and incredible. Guilford County used to receive typically 400, 500 refugees a year, and that plummeted to like dozens, less than 100 for sure. So the numbers were significantly less. And then, of course, we didn't see as many Syrian refugees. So the pipeline had really stopped for Syrian refugees. Not only has the Biden administration, well, I think then COVID. So COVID played a huge impact because many refugees, and this is a requirement of the refugee resettlement program, you have to, as a refugee, gain self-sufficiency within 90 days. So the expectation is that after 90 days, you know how to pay your rent, you have money to pay your rent, which means essentially accepting the first job that you are offered. So the refugee resettlement process here does not give you much time to actually get acclimated, learn more English, get recertified, have a breather to be able to figure out what kind of job am I qualified for, like first job. Usually that means processing factories, meat processing factories and things like that. And those jobs are jobs where you're in rooms with a lot of people, you're commuting with a lot of people because those factories are out of town. And so COVID hit the refugee community very hard. And so I think that was also a significant change that I saw over the years. The other change that I saw was because of Afghanistan and Ukraine, there is a different narrative about refugees. So there's a little bit more welcome because Afghan evacuees were framed as allies. And of course, Ukrainian refugees are European refugees. And so there's a sense in which there's more welcome. You see a more welcoming narrative around refugees. Another big change that I saw was the jump in housing prices, which really, adversely affects everybody. But refugees, their stipend hasn't changed. It's gone up by $20. And it's the same, by the way, the stipend is the same if you're resettled in Alabama or in California. So it's like $1,000 if you go to the Bay Area, where a lot of Afghan evacuees went, by the way, and to cities in California. So the incredible jump in housing that I see in Greensboro has made it impossible for refugees to find housing upon arrival, which makes programs like ECAR really valuable because you're offering that initial housing and allowing folks to figure out what their next steps are. So those are the major changes that I've witnessed. Yes, ma'am.
It would seem to me, and please correct me if my assumptions are not accurate, it would seem to me that the major countries, affluent, Germany, England, United States, Canada, cannot absorb all of the refugees, be they economic or political, what have you, climate change. We just can't do that en masse. I think Kamala Harris had gone to Central America to attempt to communicate that it was more beneficial for us as Americans to somehow encourage people to stay where they are and deal with those issues, which may be crime, corruption, what have you. sort of rhetorical. I wonder how much a responsibility we have, I think I have, for my leaders to do what they can to encourage, be it through finances or negotiations or something, to have Costa Rica or Jordan have clean up their act, so to speak. So it becomes a major political balance. I don't know, help me understand this.
Yeah, so there's, I mean, I think you're talking about a lot of different things there, right? So there's, what I'm talking about here, and hopefully that last chapter in the book is helpful in disentangling the various statuses that people experience, whether it's refugee or asylum seeker, or migrant worker, or immigrant. So, and we're talking about different parts of the world where the U.S. has intervened in many ways, and the U.S. intervention has led to displacement. So, from my perspective, it's about accountability. I think of our role and our interventions in other parts of the world as it means that we are responsible and we're accountable. And then how many resources we have. I am of the mind that we have many resources in this country. And when I look at the refugee resettlement map, and I wish I had a visual to show you, I have a great visual that I use whenever I'm trying to convince campuses to become chapters. There are parts of this country where there is no refugee resettlement at all. I mean, it sort of clusters around certain areas that we have really exhausted in terms of resources. But I think it's time to think innovatively and creatively about where people can be finding home and welcome in this country. I think we have a lot of resources, we just don't distribute them in ways that make sense. I mean, I'm thinking of a college campus where all over the summer it's basically dead space and nobody's using housing when people are homeless, or so I think it's a matter of reimagining where the resources are, how we can use those resources, and thinking about our accountability towards populations that we've displaced. I don't know how to say that this country or that can solve their own problems. We're so entangled in so many of those problems. It's really challenging to fix it, in a way that's isolated. Did you want to?
Yeah, I had a question. I'm just, oh my gosh, this whole topic is, it's hard not to mention the policies of the World Bank that prevent countries from exercising, acting in an autonomous manner with regard to their finances, their education programs, everything. But what I was going to ask was if you could speak to the role of religion. You mentioned the Muslim ban as one issue that affected refugee resettlement. I work with a lot of Karen students from Myanmar, and originally mostly from Thai refugee camps. And I'm just, and a lot of them are Christian or mad about the fact that their family's Christian, the kids, and then I've seen like articles saying, well, it's easier for them to resettle if they are Christian or convert or something like that, and I'm just curious about some of those dynamics.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I know how to answer that. Are you saying that sometimes?
I'm not saying.
Yeah.
I'm just.
My experience. Yes. Yeah. So, very fortunately for us in North Carolina, we welcome refugees from all over the world. And so on Guilford's campus alone, we've hosted up to 90 refugees so far who have been from many countries and practice different faiths. And that's the first thing that people, the first thing they ask for is the Wi-Fi. No, because they want to connect with people back home. I mean, that's the most valuable resource when they first arrive is, I've got a phone, what's the Wi-Fi so I can tell my family I'm here, or tell the person. So, but then the next thing is, where's my community? And usually that's a faith community. So folks will say, I belong to a particular kind of church. Is there such a church in Greensboro? Or where's the mosque? And so it's an incredible identity marker that really allows folks to find their communities here in Greensboro. But in Greensboro. So I would say that it's for many folks, it's a way for them to really find home here. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's for me it seems religion and people's various sort of faith backgrounds is what allows them to build community.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was also curious if there are policies that seem to favor certain religions over others or that sort of thing. I don't know.
I don't know that, but I will say that refugee resettlement came out of faith practices in this country. It started with churches.
Yeah.
So there is a
That's what I've seen
missionary
somewhere.
bent
Yeah.
to refugee resettlement practices generally. Ideologically, it's kind of behind the scenes.
Mhm.
A lot of refugee resettlement agencies want to step away from that. So like church world services, they want to be CWS. Like, don't say the word church. So it's you can see that it's in the DNA of the program, and a lot of churches are involved in supporting refugees when they come
Definitely.
here, even non-Christian refugees, right?
That's good.
So, whether there's a tension there or there's an influence there, I'm not sure, but certainly there is that kind of, the savior aspect to it that I see the dynamic play out in some of the interactions between faith communities, and especially church groups that are supporting refugee families who might not be of the same faith. Okay, thank you. Well, thank you all so much for
Thank you
being
so
here.
much.
I'm happy to answer